Welcome to Conversations That Matter. Joining me now is SFU President Andrew Petter, and today we're talking about the role of universities, particularly in an interconnected age. When people can get information from so many sources worldwide, do we really need universities as we move forward?
Well, I think it's a great question because you're right, we're flooded with information. And how do we disseminate that information? How do we make the best use of that information? I would argue this is really highlighting the difference between information and education. Education is about processing information, selecting information, deciding what information is relevant and how to use it. And that's why I think universities have become even more important, because sifting the good information from the bad, knowing how it relates to each other, knowing how to process it, and then take that information and translate it into decisions, into findings, putting it together into a narrative that makes sense, requires those higher level skills that university is really all about cultivating, skills like critical thinking, problem solving, research. So I would say in an information age, we have all of this wonderful information coming at us, but we have a heightened need for the capacity to process that information effectively.
So if we have so much information coming at us, how can an individual professor or associate professor or anybody else sift through it any better than anyone else? Like what is it that they bring to the equation that you can't figure out on your own?
One thing that professors do is they help to organize the information into thematic areas. If you're looking at something from the perspective of a history professor, obviously it's very different than if you're looking at it from the perspective of someone who's interested in communication, for example. So to provide a bit of context as to what's the purpose of the information you're looking for? What are your goals and objectives? I'm a big believer in a saying, and I don't know whoever said it, but whoever said it was very wise. They said the main fault of that people suffer from is forgetting what it is they're trying to achieve. What university can help students to do is to get a sense of what is it you're trying to achieve with the information, how do you go about obtaining the relevant information, and how then do you evaluate that information, assemble it, communicate it, do all the things that students will need to succeed in society.
Is that why a university education takes longer? Because it takes quite a while to sort your way through that and be able to develop that kind of perspective.
Yeah, I think, again, there's another distinction that's important, and that's the distinction between skills in the sense of, particular competencies that speak to particular needs, and education which not only teaches those skills in many cases, but tries to teach students how to utilize them in ways that are adaptable, that are changeable over time. So I think university education is trying to accomplish a number of things that go beyond mere skills training, as important as that may be. They're trying to teach students to understand how those skills are relevant in a social context or an economic context, what to do with them, how to apply them.
So we're in an interesting situation in British Columbia. Over the next 10 years, approximately, it's been projected that there will be 1 million job openings. So, some new, but there's going to be this huge wave of retirement that those positions need to be filled. Based on where we're at, if I go into a university education, am I not potentially missing out on some of those opportunities that might be coming available in the short run here?
Well, I'd actually argue exactly the opposite. Both in the short and in the long run, the greatest need is becoming increasingly for people who have some form of university education. The Conference Board of Canada released a study in February of this year where they surveyed a whole bunch of employers in BC, and they asked those employers, what is it they need? And what the employers said is that they need people who have a broad range of skills, but 57% of them said they need skills that are associated with university. And that's for jobs right now. They also said that there is a shortage in those skills, so we're not turning out enough people with those university skills to meet what employers need in order to grow. And they further said that as a result, the economy is losing out something like $500 million, and taxes that the province could collect are probably $600 million less than they could be.
So how are we missing out on that $500 million? Like, how does that equation play itself out?
Sorry, $5 billion on the economic,
yeah.
$5 billion on the economic growth and $600 million on the tax, I think is the number, as I would call it.
Yeah.
How are we missing out? We're missing out because, well, take the high-tech sector here in Greater Vancouver. That sector is not able to grow as fast as it would like because it's having real difficulty attracting the kind of talent that it needs. And it's not only the technical talent, it's managerial talent. It's people who can communicate and market and manage and help those companies to grow.
So how responsive can you be as a university to start to meet the needs of different emerging technologies, such as the high-tech sector? We've seen it grow exponentially over the last 25 to 30 years. But how is it that you're able to now be positioned so that you can ensure that we have those graduates that are going to continue to fill spaces at Microsoft and Sony and so on?
Well, I'm a big believer in allowing the market to influence where students go and for universities to support those choices. So again, I think a lot of people who critique universities, they think of universities 40 years ago, when you signed up for a particular program, you were stuck in that program come hell or high water.
Right.
That is not the case today. Certainly at SFU, we encourage students to be very fluid in their thinking initially. So they'll come into university maybe with some ideas as to what they want to do, but we also encourage them to get some work experience early on. So we have one of the most extensive co-op programs. So a lot of our students will participate in a work experience through co-op. They'll get a sense of what the marketplace is like. They'll get a sense of their own competencies, where they would best fit. And they'll come back and very often adjust their program choice to reflect that. So as long as universities are flexible and supportive, and as long as we encourage students to learn not only in the classroom, but in the community about what the needs are in the community and where they can best contribute, I think we can trust those students to find their way into the programs that will lead to gainful employment.
Well, I want to come back to something that you said a couple of minutes ago, that you said that industry is actually telling you, or the world of commerce is telling you that you're not graduating enough students. And that is a problem. You don't have enough seats. How do we change that?
Yeah, well, it won't surprise you to know, I think the way we change that is to invest more in post-secondary education so we can increase the number of seats that we can provide. And I'll give you the example that is constantly on my mind right now, because Simon Fraser University has 3 campuses, Burnaby, Surrey, and Vancouver. But the area that we draw from increasingly is the area south of the Fraser, where our Surrey campus is. A third of that population is under 19. It's growing by leaps and bounds. It's a population that historically has not had as many of the young people go on to university education, but increasingly they now understand that they need to, and therefore they want to. So 3 sources of pressure: the demographics, the growth, and the change in expectations. And yet there's been no increase in the number of funded spaces that we can provide to those students. And not surprisingly, what's happening is, to get into many of our programs, a program you might have gotten into 5 years ago with an 82% average, you'd be hard-pressed to get into with an 88% average.
So that money has to come from somewhere, and it comes from the provincial government. How do you convince the provincial government that this is an investment worth making? Because clearly they're not doing it right now. Well, they are to an extent, but they haven't increased funding over the last 5 years.
Well, you know, Stu, if you look around the world and you see those economies that are really succeeding and growing, they are economies that have decided to invest in education. We've heard the provincial government in the last budget talk about BC's strength being in diversification. The thing that enables us to have a vibrant and diverse economy is having the talent to support that diverse and vibrant economy. I think it is important to characterize it as an investment. But I'll go back to the Conference Board of Canada study, because I use the word investment and people say, oh yeah, there he goes again, university president wanting to put more funds into education because he's a university president. What the Conference Board of Canada says is, from an employer's point of view, employers could do a lot more if they had more university graduates, and graduates from technical schools and colleges, by the way, as well. 57% were university, but the rest were from other parts of the post-secondary sector. And they're saying that they could grow the economy. And the Conference Board, not me as a university president, went out and quantified that. And as I say, they quantified it at a figure just shy of $5 billion that we're not gaining in GDP growth because we're not investing. And the tax return to the provincial treasury would have been something like $600 million, which could have been used, or just a portion of which could have been used to create that wealth.
Is it true that if you take a look at areas where there's a good concentration of university grads and universities, that the GDP of that area far exceeds those regions that don't have that kind of post-secondary level education?
Yeah, I mean, I can't cite you the studies, but I can certainly tell you that in terms of the kinds of countries and kinds of jurisdictions that have been really moving forward and succeeding, it's been accompanied by a major commitment to investment in education and research. When I go to China, and I now go to China fairly often because we have strong connections with Chinese universities, and a lot of students come to us from China as well. You go into university campus, you see construction cranes going up, you see new investment, you see new programs, and I think it's been one of the major reasons why the Chinese economy has been growing as quickly as it has. But the same is true in Singapore, the same is true in the Nordic countries, and the same is true of countries like Korea.
You bring up China, and there's a lot of people in British Columbia who look to the universities and go, okay, you're saying that you don't have enough room for domestic students or Canadian students, and yet there's all this room for foreign students. How does that work? Why do you do that? Like, just don't let them in, put more Canadian students in.
Yeah.
Is that the way that it works?
It's not the way that it works, but I understand why people might think that. I mean, I think the important thing is that we do have enough spaces for domestic students, but that's a function of whether or not the provincial government will invest in universities and enable us to create those spaces.
So enough spaces so long as you have an 88% average
Well, no,
grade
I would
average.
like to,
Yeah.
I'll tell you the commitment that I would like to make, and the commitment that the research universities asked all parties to make prior to the last election, was a commitment for every qualified student to have a space in a post-secondary institution that aligned with their talents and their needs. That should be the aspiration. I mean, I think it's a tragedy when any individual doesn't get to achieve their full potential. And it's not just a tragedy for that kid, it's a tragedy for us as a society because we're losing the benefit. But
because they're not contributors
yeah,
then at their peak potential.
Yeah, but that under the way we fund universities in BC, that's a function of whether or not the programs are being funded for those domestic students. The international students, they are not subsidized by the taxpayer. They pay a much higher tuition fee in order to cover their full costs. And as a result, they are added value to the university. In fact, there's probably a lot of programs, given budget cuts, that we couldn't have maintained for all students if we didn't have increased numbers of international students. So on the other hand, I know if I'm a parent and my kid can't get into a university, even though she's got an 82% average, and I think, why is that? And then I see international students getting in, I could be forgiven for thinking that's because there's a preference for international students, even though it isn't. But it does speak to the need, as a matter of policy and a matter of commitment, for us to make sure we do have spaces for all those domestic students who are qualified and have the capacity.
So there's a part of university life that I think is important, and that is the social aspect, the interhuman connection that exists, especially when you're in a long-term program. If that exists domestically, what's the benefit when you introduce foreign students? Like, what's the long-term benefit of developing those relationships?
It's huge, and it's not necessarily easy because you really have to work at it as a university to make sure that the foreign students are integrating and connecting with domestic students and vice versa. Why do you want to do that? Well, you want to do it because there's so much to be gained for the students. I mean, one of the things that's said about Canadian students, and we're working at this too, is they don't travel overseas as much as I think we would like. So we try to get more students to travel overseas. But the next best thing, if you can travel overseas, is to get that global experience here at home. And universities in BC, and I would say Simon Fraser is a leader in this regard, because we do attract so many international students, we can provide that global environment so students can learn about other countries, about other cultures. They can gain language capabilities if they choose to. They can make friends that are friends not only within the university, but friends for life that create networks. My son went to a university in London which I think was well over 50% international students. Now, whenever he travels anywhere in the world, he has a place to stay, and he has a connection to that community. I think it's a benefit for us to have international students, not only because they obviously are an economic contributor, but because they do bring to us a whole range of knowledge and culture that we wouldn't otherwise benefit from, and our students wouldn't benefit from. One of the strengths of Canada is we have a fairly open immigration policy, thank goodness, because that skill shortage that you're talking about, when people like me with my gray hair leave the workforce.
Many years from now.
Well,
Yeah.
no, I'm not going to take any bets on that. But that skill shortage is not going to be filled simply out of our domestic population. Even if we completely meet our goals in terms of educating our domestic students, it will not be sufficient to meet that shortage that is coming. We'll need international students. So some will stay here and contribute in that way. Others won't stay here. Others will go back to their countries of origin or other countries. But they then become people who can help build relationships that are social but also economic for businesses and for universities and for governments going forward, and help to strengthen our international profile, our international connections.
One of the other aspects that I want to talk about with universities is research. Without universities, how much research would happen in British Columbia or Canada as a whole?
Well, one of the things in Canada that's always been a challenge is getting the R&D, getting the research and development. And I think, I don't want to oversimplify it, but there's a couple of obvious reasons why it's been difficult in Canada. One is that the larger companies we have very often are branch plants of U.S. headquartered or companies that are headquartered elsewhere, and they tend to do the R&D where they're headquartered or where there are larger population centers. And so there's much less research taking place here than one might expect otherwise. And smaller companies often don't have the internal capacity, the critical mass to do that research. So if you look at the statistics show that we have been certainly not doing as well as we could on private sector research and on productivity within the company associated with that research. We have been doing, I think, better than most other countries in terms of university-based research. But, and it's an important but, I don't think we've been doing as well as we could do and we need to do in taking that strength of university-based research and translating it into benefit within the economy. And this is something that I must say I, as president of SFU, am very focused on. We're working right now on an innovation agenda. And I think we have a number of models we've developed that will help to take that research capacity and translate it into jobs and economic development in a way that perhaps under the traditional university model, it hasn't occurred as much as it could.
Are we not in a unique position, though, where you have talent at the university? Don't you have an environment where you can attract, in particular, American companies and say, come and do your research here because we can help reduce your costs. It's less expensive to do it here, and we can provide your staff with health care.
Well, we do know that there are American companies that are locating here for a range of reasons. I mean, Microsoft brought part of their operation to Greater Vancouver, I think in part because of the immigration policy, in part for the reason you give. There's a huge talent pool. We see a whole bunch of high-tech companies that are locating offices or facilities here, even though they're headquartered elsewhere, because they see the opportunity to gain some of the advantages you talk about. We're also able to attract partners. We at Simon Fraser, for example, have partnered with the Indian Oil Company, one of the largest companies in India that oversees the extraction and delivery of oil, or the import and delivery of oil in India. But they want to diversify. SFU is a leader in fuel cell technology and hydrogen technology. And as a result, Indian Oil has essentially made us their Canadian research partner along the lines that you're talking about, and is sending graduate students from India to study with us, is asking us to work with them in developing their research capacity. If you have strong research capability in areas of high need, and if you have a livable environment with good education and healthcare systems and transportation systems, you stand to gain economically, not only from what you can do in terms of growing the economy locally, but also attracting investment from overseas. If
you want to grow, and in particular to be able to meet that need south of the Fraser, how much do you need support from the community as well? Does philanthropy play a role in funding universities in the future? Because it hasn't been traditionally the way that we've done it here in Canada.
Well, I think philanthropy is certainly an important part of the equation. If you look at our downtown campus, virtually every building in our downtown campus has names on it of
Yes,
people
it
who
does.
contributed.
Yeah.
And that's not by accident. That's because Simon Fraser wanted to do something different. They knew they couldn't do it based on government alone, and they went out to the community, and the community supported it. And that will and is happening in Surrey. In fact, Surrey, one of our big partners, is not only individuals and private organizations, but the city of Surrey has partnered with us. They suddenly see that there's huge opportunities working with us, so they've helped to create a chair in clean energy to work with them on being more efficient in the way that they manage their energy supplies.
10 years from now, what's the university environment in British Columbia going to look like? Will it be much different than it is today, or what's its potential?
Well, let me tell you what I want it to be, what I hope it will be. I think BC, first of all, let me be really clear. I think BC has an incredibly strong education system. We owe a lot to people dating back to W.A.C. Bennett. W.A.C. Bennett was a very smart guy, and he decided that a system that was diverse would be one that would be very, very strong. So he created community colleges. He created institutions that have morphed into teaching universities. He created institutes. And he created research universities, and the research universities are different from each other. They have different strengths and different capabilities. And that diversity is not something that's typical of other jurisdictions. There's a lot of jurisdictions that have a lot of universities that are doing more or less the same thing. In BC, we have the strength of a system that is diverse and complementary. I would like people to have the comfort level 5 or 10 years from now to say trippingly off the tongue, BC is the education province. It's the place you look to and go if you have an idea to grow a company, or you need the talent in order to succeed economically. This is the go-to place. So I'd like to have people think of BC as an education province that is really there as an economic driver for the province, but also as a place that's socially, because of that educational commitment, is seen as socially progressive and ahead of its time.
I have to admit that I have never thought of that as a possibility, because traditionally you in Canada you think, well, that center of educational excellence is in central Canada.
Well, I'll tell you, in terms of research, income and performance, if you look at what's happened in the last few years, the success rate of universities has been out here in the West, out in BC. We have outperformed, we've punched way beyond our strength. We've outperformed the average across the country. You know, SFU is ranked, I think it's 16th in the world and 3rd in North America amongst universities under 50 years of age. You know, and I think maybe it's because Canadians generally, and British Columbians in particular, have a bit of an inferiority complex, so we're a little bit modest. We don't like to brag, and I don't like to brag, but we should be proud of this. This is
I'm really happy to hear you say this.
Yeah, and it would be great if we could celebrate it a little bit more and see it as a strength on which we can build.
I hope you're right. I wish you luck. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.